blood paradigm, by the misunderstood Panther. Chapter 1. Introduction. We find ourselves in a time of enigma and illusion. The modern man will grow to watch the world degenerate before his very eyes, and there appears to be no agent of cessation for this temporal flow. The modern man will watch the acute descent from quality to quantity, and the inertia of this descent which precludes any termination of it. The decadence is comparable to that of an airborne contagion, with material reality being its degeneration, inherent mode of conduct, more specifically through means of propaganda, brainwashing, degeneracy, and the internet. To more accurately articulate how this detriment is permeated throughout the world, we will firstly assess the behavior exhibited by those who have been corrupted in nature. The first significant trait of these men is the innate deficit of tradition of which is present in their lives. They do not hold a higher dogma or virtue, no morals or ethics which constitute their behavior. They have exempted themselves from tradition or religion and live barbaric lives without reason or motive. This extraction of will or motive, fundamentally cannot thrive, especially through the test of time. Therefore, those men who have realized a nihilist worldview are significantly provisional and transient, dying at young ages and pursuing pleasure and greed. Without meaning, and without reason, nothing can exist. What is meant by this is that these men will take the lives of their brethren, and even their own, as it is self-destructive in its nature. Wars have, and will transpire without reason, and men will kill men for the sake of it. The modern nihilist as a phenotype of the modern world may warrant self-destruction before even beginning to initiate the actions necessary for their never-ending desire. They want what they cannot have, and what they do not need. To reiterate, without the basis of tradition or meaning, they are dynamic and chaotic to magnitudes beyond any qualification, because there is no system in which this chaos operates. There is no measuring of the potential lunacy that these men may reach, however it is unlikely to assume they will live long, for they are in executive paralysis due to the absence of motive. This will be expounded upon more in the next trait, namely, it is intimately connected with habituation, addiction, and indulging in provisional pleasures of the corporeal domain. Secondly, we will examine the trait of degeneracy as expressed through pleasure and sin. Let it be understood the etymology of the word sin used here is not in exclusive reference to Christian doctrine, but is rather synonymous with wrongdoing, as an infringement of tradition or faith. The modern man has exhibited a tendency to form a dependence on ephemeral pleasures, such as abusing mind-altering inhibitors, solely for euphoric and escapist purposes. A cardinal point to be made, however, is that it is not to be confused with entheogenic or shamanic substance usage, which is rooted in tradition. Another observable constant in this pseudo-refuge would be that of the perverse and never fulfilled sexual desires of these men. More specifically, that of men engaging in unfaithful relations with women outside of his respective marriage. Perhaps it would not be inaccurate to postulate that these men tend to engage in sexual relations with prostitutes. We have already watched the grotesque perversion of sexuality in the modern world, and the westernization and fetishization of ancient traditions that may include sexuality, such as Tantra, and for the foreseeable future these men will only continue to obscure sexuality. A practice, rite once known as sacred and dualistic in nature, has turned into a quantified pleasure indulgence, sometimes with multiple partners. These men want pleasure, and will endorse violence and rape if that is the enterprise necessitated by their evisceration. Another paradigm that is perhaps less familiar would be the consumption of media, especially that of moral-less cinema, literature and games, meretricious for the consumer. There is no value in the works, even though the industry appears to be monolithic and substantial. More specifically, they will heroize artificial archetypes, like cyborgs, or superheroes, not to be confused with Nietzsche's Übermensch, in an attempt to deprive the exposure of traditional masculinity and archetypes and transpose them with that of contrived pseudo-heroes. With the infatuation of forlorn pleasures, it is effectively impossible for a man subject to degeneracy to partake in any meaningful endeavor while he is chained to the weight of pleasure. Lastly, but not the last trait to be mentioned in this book in retrospect, is that of violence and hatred. When speaking of evil or hatred, it is imperative that it must not be marginalized as yet another integer, such as that of sorrow, greed, beauty, love, etc., but rather the epithet ascribed to that of which is the absence of good, or love, for it is not something complete in itself when speaking in application or manifestation of the presence of this vice. When men deny God, and wish to live in the absence of God, they will inherently manifest a mode of being which is characterized by lack of compassion and goodwill. If they deny the existence of any higher authoritative power, and secrete hubris from their person as they believe they are the only thing that matters, their downfall will be catalyzed by their philosophy, because the modern solipsist has no creator but himself, and that is simply not true for the human spirit. With these cardinal, but not all, qualities which define the tragic case of the modern man, infected by the contagion of degeneracy, we can now further examine and expound the catalysts, the means of transmission, and the inevitable downfall of the aberration from tradition.